Good morning. This session has a very impressive title of Memorization Tips from the Ancients. And I'm sure you think I'm going to hand out 99 tips and it's going to solve your teaching problem. Alas, that is not so. But I did have some fun when I was investigating, doing some research on this topic. I want to spend a little bit of time kind of explaining how I got to this topic, if I can start at the beginning. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Thomas Korczak's book, Lutheran Education? Yes, I mean, what a mind-blowing experience that was to read. And one of the insights in Dr. Korczak's book, which almost was just a throwaway. I mean, he didn't elaborate or make it very stress it too much. But he had a very brief discussion on classical education's innovative characteristic of flexibility. Innovative characteristic of flexibility. Now, I don't think that the people who are against classical education in particular are concerned about our flexibility. And I'm not sure that we actually think about classical education with its emphasis on grammar, rules, and logic, and very specific patterns. I don't think we think about it as quite that way either, to figure out, oh, that's flexible. I mean, we know classical education has to have the trivium, it has to have the quadrivium. Within it, we have the grammar, logic, rhetoric, we have arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, and we're quite familiar with the requirements. And so you don't usually think flexibility and requirements are going together. So where am I seeing this flexibility? Well, Dr. Korczak wrote about the ancients, meaning the Latin and Greek scholars, that the Latin and Greek scholars most highly valued rhetoric as a means of demonstrating knowledge. Okay? So they really put the emphasis on the rhetoric as the higher art, so to speak. Whereas he said the medieval scholars valued logic as the stronger means of demonstrating and sharing knowledge. Now, just because they valued one means of demonstrating knowledge over another means did not mean that they in any way ignored the other methods or the other areas. So all areas of the trivium and the quadrivium were to be mastered. But they had, they took kind of the opportunity to utilize one area a little bit more than the others. And so they kind of had their preferences. And if you think about the ancients, meaning the Latin and the Greek, it makes sense that rhetoric, oral communication, would be much more feasible for them. Whereas in the Middle Ages, when they finally, developed papyrus and they weren't having to use clay and stylus, things like that, it was a little easier for them to write things down. They could be a little bit more elaborate and logical. So it just was a preference, okay? So they had that flexibility to be somewhat, address their preferences. And this apparent flexibility, Dr. Korczak used the example of music. Do you remember how when he was discussing music, when he and Philip Melanchthon were working to kind of develop the curriculum of the new gymnasium, the classical education, and that they were developing for their schools, they adjusted music. And so I'm trying to pick my verbs very carefully, especially if there's any music teachers in here. They adjusted it because they took out the focus of on the abstract theory, the theoretical focus, and they shifted it over to a more concrete application of performing music. They didn't take music out. They just kind of shifted how they addressed it. Okay? So to me, that kind of seems like almost some flexibility, and it might be some flexibility, a method of, or an aspect of flexibility, a perspective of flexibility that we could be using today. I mean, even in the past century, since classical education has had a renewal, you know, there have been the tweakings of, which some might say indicate some flexibility. I mean, we have Dorothy L. Sayers who say, and her proponents of it, the trivium and the quadrivium are subjects, period. And then we have more like the CCLE, where we say, yes, they're subjects, and, because we're a big believe, you know, we believe in and, both, and, very much. It's both curriculum and methodology, that there's a grammar to every content area. Dorothy L. Sayers people would say, no, grammar is language grammar only. We say, no, it's every language. There's the basic, essential information in every content area, every discipline. So, what I'm trying to clumsily perhaps get to is to kind of extrapolate from Dr. Korchak's insight about somewhat the flexibility, is that in our current educational environment, and by the way, I was really struck with Dr. Calvert's quotation from Martin Luther, you know, when schools flourish, all flourish, because I immediately thought, and when the schools are in trouble, can we say that's what we're seeing right now? Seriously. So anyway, in this current educational environment, meaning the whole profession of education, neither a focus on logic, like the medieval ages, or the focus on rhetoric is going to serve our students' needs. And here's the big underlined on my speech: without an initial intensive focus on grammar. So it may be that our calling is to really bring back the grammar of all the content areas so that our students can then go on into the logic and rhetoric. Because they're not going into logic and rhetoric without the grammar. This means learning the rules and the essential facts, the relationships of the content areas, not just language grammar, but science grammar, math grammar, history grammar, art grammar, music grammar, etc. So are you following me along with my thought here? If you are, I'm impressed. What I'm suggesting is that, I'm not suggesting that we only focus on grammar. We are not the back to basics movement. I've often mentioned to my pedagogy students that various reforms in the past couple of decades have all been just a single view of classical education. Because back to the basics, they're talking about grammar. Back to the basics. The critical thinking, they're talking about logic. But they don't want to bother with learning the grammar first. They want to make sure you can think critically, even though you have nothing to think about. And then the self-esteem and the express yourself, communication, that's all focusing on rhetoric. But again, you don't need to be logical in your expression, and you certainly don't need to know anything. You just need to be able to express yourself. So those are all just inaccurate one perspective of classical education. We need it all, but we really have got to start at the beginning, and that is the grammar level. I would say that one reason classically educated students achieve as much as they do can be traced back to their educational habits of mind, which are established where? At the grammar stage. You don't start a habit in the rhetoric level. You begin to inculcate it, and you nurture it, and then you support it through logic, and then you really refine it in the rhetoric. But if you're just starting at the rhetoric level, those students do not really have the habit of mind for warning. And of course, and again, Dr. Coburn mentioned Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Training, and I don't want to get into the semantic argument about training versus educating. We're just going to say, okay, training and educating, same thing. Training a child means training both physical and mental abilities in children. Mental abilities, faculties, include memorization. As a foreign language teacher myself when I first started teaching, I was teaching French and Spanish to students who had no concept of English grammar. So it was really, I had the job of inspiring very disinterested students to memorize, because I would just say to them, how can you have a conversation if you don't know the vocabulary? How can you speak without words? Well, guess they were going to use body language or something. But to me, it was very necessary and logical that students memorize vocabulary, spelling, and grammar rules. Of course, if you've heard some of their English, cultural information. But a lot of my colleagues did not agree. So in a foreign language class, they did not require memory work. I never could quite understand that. So when I finally graduated from high school teaching and got into college teaching, I started doing some research on memorizing, and I discovered a fascinating pattern. Educational researchers, almost all educational researchers, and I'm only giving the caveat because in higher ed you can never say all, because there could be one, that would be the exception. Almost all educational researchers connect learning with being able to remember something. What a concept. If a student can't remember X, that student has not learned X. If a student cannot perform Y, that student did not learn Y. Educational researchers start from that assumption that the student is able to remember or perform something. But the ideological pathway, and you know what I'm talking about, if you went through any state education-approved teacher certification program, preparing future teachers to teach the skill of learning to remember information, it has been replaced. And it has not been replaced with anything more than, oh, here, use a calculator. I mean, if you have ever struggled with a fifth grader who cannot add single digits, here, use a calculator. Or, don't worry about remembering those dates or those places. You can Google it. You don't need to know the facts. You can just find them online. I have heard teachers tell students that. Have you? I mean, I hope you have not, since you're all in classical Lutheran schools, but I have heard school teachers tell them that. Imagine a basketball coach who doesn't schedule practice, or a literature teacher who never requires written essays, or a Spanish teacher who doesn't require her students to practice speaking Spanish. This is how teachers who don't help their students develop memory skills dumb down their students. You're not giving them the tools they need. You think you're being kind to them. No homework, you don't need to memorize this. But you are not. You are hobbling them. Educational practitioners, and again, that's the higher ed way of calling teachers. Educational practitioners, in fact, are not following what educational researchers have established. Students need to memorize material. Period. The more material students memorize, the stronger their memorization ability becomes, and the easier it is to memorize more. Now, does anybody recall a rather prominent educator, researcher who's made a lot of money lately off of kind of this idea? I just thought maybe somebody might. E.D. Hirsch. I mean, he said we all need to learn the same things, and we need to remember them to have a common core of knowledge. That's not the same common core, by the way. But okay. So these two different lines that of experience and research and my curiosity led me to wonder, how did classically, it's not showing up right on my PowerPoint, how did classically educated, in other words, how did the ancient scholars remember what they learned? Before audio and video record, before computer, before technology, how did they learn? How can they remember it? Do we have access to their secret knowledge and their techniques? In fact, we do. They wrote the books. They told us what worked for them. They understood the need to memorize. They developed steps to memorize, and they wrote them down. This is going to be irritating, because how do I get that to be just the one slide? Does anyone know?
I can fix it for you if you like.
I would appreciate that, because I am not a technically gifted individual.
It's going to take me just a second.
That would be wonderful. I appreciate that so much.
Is that on the other screen? Let's try this now.
See, I would have to memorize step by step at this point.
There you go.
Oh, thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. So they understood the need to memorize. They developed steps, and they wrote them down. For millennia, teachers and students have used them and benefited them, or reinvented them if they didn't realize the origins of it. But there's a caveat. And this is what I was referring to when you came in earlier, and I said, oh, you expect I'm going to give you 99 tips and it's going to be easy. It is not easy. It is still work. It is still work. It may be easier or harder for different people. Some people are gifted with easier ability to memorize. Some students will struggle unbelievably. But the same happens with just about any skill, physical gifts and mental gifts. I cannot remember for you, and you cannot remember for me. A parent cannot remember for their child, and it's not allowed for the one child to remember for the other child. You can do many things for your students, but you cannot remember for them. So it's why the skill of teaching them how to develop their memory is so critical. Now, before we dig into the steps about strengthening memory skills, and if you have a question at any time, feel free to ask. I may not have an immediate answer, but we'll certainly be happy to entertain it. We need to define memory systems. There are two main memory systems. Are you familiar with that idea that there is a short-term memory kind of what we call our working memory, and then long-term memory. Okay, I mean, as a teacher, this is why we review. So, okay, short-term and long-term. The working memory, which is the short-term, is the active processing center. Active processing center. And the long-term memory is the storage center. Okay? The long-term memory itself does not engage in thinking or learning processes, but it still has a large impact, a large, significant influence, because when you go to recall your the information you're going after, that's the storage system. That's where it is, and how it is in your storage system is the difference between night and day. So the short term is active and busy. The long term is inert and does not change, ideally. And how? But the two work together, and that's how we bring up our memories. Okay, that's a super short 3-credit course on the neurology of memory. But these terms are two constructs that are very useful in helping us work through developing memorization skills. Short-term memory is what I call our working memory. It's very limited in the amount of material it holds. And this might really, I mean, you might, when you hear this, you might be going, oh, so no wonder my students are struggling. In 1956, cognitive psychologist George Miller, you guys have all heard of him, right? What? No. He suggested, in a very, very famous paper for cognitive psychologists, that the average human can only retain 7 plus or minus 2 items at a time. So our Social Security number, or our telephone numbers, that's it. If you have an extraordinary memory, you might be able to add them together or something. I mean, but really, our short-term, our working memory, 5 to 9 items, and that's the limit of what we can remember. That's going to come into play big time later. Long-term memory, as I said before, is our storage. It's not limited. It can hold everything you can stuff into it. It's like the TARDIS. It's just big, you just keep putting more and more stuff in it, and it just keeps going. Okay, I appreciate those who understood my TARDIS. It's an infinite file folder that you can just keep putting things in. But everything that's in that file folder has to be processed when it's to be put in there. Has to be deposited in order for you then to recollect it out. Okay, so do you see how I'm describing the act of memorizing and the organization and putting it in the long term, and then remembering is the pulling it back out. Okay. If it cannot be pulled back out, all that work and effort that those poor children put into it, waste of time, waste of energy, waste of, I mean, think of the tears, everything. No, just, if they can't pull it out, it's gone. They never really learned it, or they didn't learn it in a way that helps them. So we have a clear understanding, or at least a working understanding of short and long-term memory, and how we want to take everything at the short term, well, not everything, but most of the good stuff in the short term, put it into the long term, and then enable our students to pull it out of the long term when they need it. And when do they need it? It could be for the quiz tomorrow. It could be for the semester exam. It could be 30 years later when they're staring at their wall trying to calculate how much paint do I need to buy. You know, you never know when they're going to need it. That's why it's called long-term memory. Long-term memory. Okay. So now let's think about what did some of these ancient scholars and students in their own time, what did Aristotle say about memorization. In De Memoria a Reminiscentia, it was very important to him that he distinguished between perception and time. Now, this may not excite you at all, but he wanted to make the point and make sure everybody understood that we can't remember the future. We can't. It hasn't happened yet to us in our temporal timeline. We can't remember the future. We can't remember the present because we're only experiencing it right now. We are perceiving it. So to him, those perceptions were really critical. That the past was the only thing we could remember. And the past, to him, was an objective, completed item. Nowadays, in our relativistic world, we look at the past and we're so busy rewriting it. Because after all, marriage is not between a man and a woman. I'm sorry, I'm just still upset about that. But the past had happened and was finished. It could not be changed. The past could not be changed. And so, that's not exactly the pertinent quote, but anyway, so he was trying to make sure people understood that as they're perceiving things now, they need to perceive it in ways that allow them to put it into their short-term memory, to put it into their he wasn't using those expressions, but he wanted people to understand that perceptions were really important. So, when it came to Aristotle writing about how do you remember, this is what he was making the point, is that if he had not perceived it and had not hooked what he wanted to remember adequately to a specific perception, that stopped him and he was unable to remember anything else past that perception. Does that make sense? It's okay if it doesn't. He felt that the order in which you remembered things was essential. The order in which you remember. So that if you're trying to remember numbers, and I'm kind of making this one up on my feet right now. If you're trying to remember numbers going 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, 10, that was not going to help. If you were missing parts of it, if your perception had been incomplete, because remember, he thinks of the past as an objective, completed item. You remember the whole thing. You remember it accurately. And if you're remembering it inaccurately, that's almost worse. Or that's just the same thing as not remembering it at all. And that's what he's saying, that if you... the term next after the starting point. He's trying to stress that you need to remember it all. Get it in an order and remember it all. Okay.
Matthew, are you referring here to very factual type of information? Because I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, but I can experience or have memory that I pull out, and I think we all do all the time. The perception of what it was, it changes. You don't remember it as accurately as many people telling memories that quite most didn't happen.
Well, see, and that's where, again, for him, the past was I had to give one that was a completed thing, that was an unchangeable thing. To him, the past was unchangeable. Now, you're right, when we try to remember, we're not remembering as accurately because we didn't memorize, and our perception of an event going on at the time, we didn't memorize it and pull in every single perception that he would have. I have something else I think that might help address that, but it's because we don't memorize, we don't have the strength of the memory skill that he had. Yeah.
So when you're memorizing, say, skip counting for math, okay, so keeping, when you skip count, but when we do the facts, we mix them up.
No,
what are
yeah.
you getting at? Is that not the direction you're going in?
Not exactly, and there's nothing wrong with that. Once they have them,
Skip counted
yeah.
in order, right? But
Yeah.
would you also do the math facts in order first, and then you can mix
yes,
them up?
do them in
Okay.
order first, and then, and keep constantly that reviewing, which again we're going to talk about.
I think a good example when you're talking about learning is inventive spelling. Because
Yes.
if a child sees the word, writes it, and it's not corrected,
Yes,
that's
what they're
what
establishing.
that's
They're,
their introduction to it, and that's what they remember.
exactly.
That's what he's,
Yeah. The inaccurate perceptions, because again, Aristotle said you perceive the present. That's what you put into your short-term memory. And if it's inaccurate or incomplete, that's what you're going to be able to remember. That's the most you'll be able to remember. So, okay. But you have to start somewhere. And Aristotle said, okay, you have to start somewhere. Appreciate that concept. And so he said start, sometimes it helps to start from mnemonic loci. Mnemonic loci. Okay, mnemonic. Don't worry, we're going to cover mnemonics. Mnemonics. It's a Greek word itself, so that obviously tells you how long they've been using it. Of memory, relating to memory. Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory in Greek mythology. They relied on mnemonics. And so that was one of the first strategies or techniques that they ever wrote down. And mnemonics in the method of loci. Remember what loci is in Latin? Place, exactly. Mnemonics and place. So we're going to spend some time on tips about mnemonics and tips about the method of loci or place. So, I think I'm about ready for that. Okay. Mnemonics are techniques or devices for aiding memory, processing, recall, and recollection actions. And frankly, a lot of teachers use these, even today. You've invented them yourselves, even if you didn't know that's what you were doing. Now, I've never heard of an administrator recommending, okay, I want all my faculty to use mnemonics when you're teaching phonics. I want all my I've never heard of that. So I think it is pretty much an individual kind of thing. I do know that, for instance, when I was teaching Spanish, I went to a conference, and they said, use the word place to teach the difference when you use a star instead of ser. Place, that's a mnemonic. P stands for position, L for location, A for action, C for condition, and E for emotion. In those conditions, you should use a star and not ser. Well, that's a mnemonic. So it might be that you're familiar with some in the particular content area, but generally, again, I've never heard an administrator say, all right, teachers, let's all use mnemonics this year. This is our mnemonic year to teach our students. But it's a very useful technique, and I'm sure that each of you have made up some kind of mnemonic yourself to help your students. So, the key organizing concept for mnemonics or learning by memory is attention. Again, remember I said memorizing takes work. You have to pay attention. If you don't pay attention, or your students are not paying attention, they are not going to be successful. Mnemonics is using connections to create memories that will help the student retrieve the pertinent information. This is where we're talking again about the perceptions. They're creating connections from their perceptions to be able to put whatever the information is into their memory. Any mental faculty, or strategy rather, any mental strategy that facilitates the learning of material by using any other initially extraneous material is a mnemonic. To be effective, mnemonics need to have three criteria. They need to be constructible, they need to have associability, and they need to have discriminability. All right? So they need to be able, you need to be able to make them up. You need to be able to make that association, that perception. Yeah, that perception and this connection, they make sense. And then you need to be able to, okay, I'm thinking about this, and I'm pulling the right information out. Because if I'm thinking about this, and it's making me pull out this information, that isn't going to help. If I'm using place, and I still can't distinguish between Sarah and a star, I'm not using it. It's not making any sense. So the individual, the student, must be able to construct the image or pattern, must be able to associate the information into the image or pattern, and must be able then to apply the image or pattern to distinguish the specific information they want. Now, obviously, like I said before, this is not a recent development. I'm talking about it in the fancy terminology of contemporary educational research. This is not news. The first recorded case of the method of loci is attributed to the Greek poet Simonides. Anybody heard of Simonides? You're never going to forget him after this story. Are you at? Good. Yeah. The story of Simonides is told by Quintilian, among other ancients. And again, Quintilian, if you ever have a chance to read some of his writing, wrote tremendous information about memorizing and about education in general. He wrote, the first to teach an art of memory is said to have been Simonides, of whom this story is related. There's Simonides there. That when for a stipulated sum he had written in honor of a pugilist who had won the crown, an ode of the kind usually composed for conquerors in the games, half of the money was refused him. Okay. So here we have this guy who won a contest, write a poem in my honor, I'm going to throw a party, you come and recite the poem. All of this, he did. But the guy stiffed him half of the money. Because, according to a practice very common with the poets, he had made a digression in honor of Castor and Pollux, for which reason he was told to apply for the other half to the deities, whose praises he had chosen to include. Okay? The deities paid it. How did they pay it? During the fancy party, during the splendid entertainment in honor of the victory, Simonides was called away by a message. There were two men outside on horses who needed to see him. So he goes out, and there are no two men on horses. There's no one there. But as he's gone out, the banquet hall collapses. The roof falls down. Everyone is instantly smashed to unrecognizable pulp. Now, you tell this story to your students, and the guys, the boys will be just fascinated. They'll want to memorize everything. So, he's spared. He is the only survivor of this disaster. Well, all of the sad, grieving families want to be able to do the burial rites for their deceased, but they can't even tell which ones they are. Simonides is the only one who can identify the remains by the location of where they were laying down or reposing or reclining. So he gets the credit for inventing the method of loci by memorizing. I mean, he is a poet. His memory was super strong. He would look at a view, and you take a view, and he would have his perception, he would be able to identify all of you if this roof fell in. I'm sorry, I could not. But, so he gets the credit for identifying due to this really interesting story. From what Simonides did on that occasion, it established that memory is assisted by localities impressed upon the mind. Localities. Again, your perceptions, the present is we're perceiving. Everyone can, you can yourself admit that when you go back to a place, you may not have been there for years, but you go back to a place and all of a sudden, oh yeah, remember, this happened here.
That's where I'm guessing you might forget something, and then if you walk back into the room where you originally had that memory, then it comes back to you.
Right. Oh, why? And I'd say that's happening a lot more often.
Yeah.
But yeah, why did I come into this room? I'm going to go back into the kitchen. Oh yeah, I needed something as simple as that. Or again, if you've moved away from where you grew up and you go back to visit, you haven't thought about your childhood friends or your neighborhood for years, and then all of a sudden you're telling your kids, oh yeah, this creek, this is where we caught the crawdads, and this is where the location, the perception of your location is deep in your mind, deep in your memories. Mnemonics is saying, use that intentionally. Use that intentionally. Aristotle recommended the practice to form very vivid, active images of ideas, and we still do that today. When we're learning foreign language vocabulary, when people are learning Latin, and you've got new vocabulary words. Are there some Latinists in the audience? Okay. How do you? What are the images that you use? The pictures that you use to help your students remember a Latin vocabulary word? Like sailor. What is sailor?
Sailor is nauta.
Nauta.
So I think of like a ship and a nave.
Nave, and probably bring in navy, and so you're drawing images for them, and very likely have images of them as well. So what are your students going to imagine in their mind in order to pull nauta out? They're going to think of that picture. That's what they perceived. Okay? So that method of loci in the Middle Ages, that was par excellence. Ancient teachings on memorization emphasize two different aspects that in practice do not seem to have much to do with each other. And this is, I've tried to tie together a couple of different things that we've already mentioned. One is the idea in the Middle Ages, known primarily through the works of Aristotle, that defines the memories as being of the past. Again, a completed, done, objective memory that cannot be tampered with. Okay, and this might be what's going to address your questions, Susan. Augustine in the Confessions and elsewhere emphasized the temporal nature of memories on how we perceive time, but he stressed, let me make sure I'm saying this as carefully as I can, that remembering, you can only remember the past, but you can only remember in the present. And that the fact that we're in the present is coloring our perception of looking back at the past. And that's where I think our incomplete perceptions of the past at the time making the memory is what affects that memory when we draw it out. Does that make sense?
A little bit, I guess.
Think on these things. The other assertion was that memory requires location. And one of the techniques of location was not just And it was kind of, we were talking about before about, okay, what was I doing? Where was I when I learned this information? What was I doing? What desk was I sitting at? What, did I have a pen in my hand? Did I have a bottle of water or a cup of coffee? What was I doing? Who was I standing next to? Who was I talking to when I heard that? That sense of location, recreating the experience of creating the memory, as opposed to trying to associate the information with something else in a mnemonic device. And both of those fall into location. So they're calling it the method of location, but they're very flexible in how they're applying it. So, okay. The other thing about Augustine, he said there is a difference between my past and the past. My past and the past. So, if he did not experience something, he could not remember it because it wasn't in his past. It was still, it had happened. He could learn about it from other people, and it happened. He was not denying that it happened, but it was not in his past. So his, and I think this is something that, this is the situation all of our students are in. They're learning about other people's past. You know, didn't happen to them, so they don't have that perception of how to bring it out of their long-term memory. It didn't happen to them. It happened a long time ago and to other people. And so somehow we have to create the association to help them create the perception so that they can pull it out. Does that help? Okay. 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 Mary Carruthers has recently published a book called The Medieval Craft of Memory, which was one of the resources I used to come up with this presentation. And she makes the point that techniques of memory craft were fundamental in the various subjects of the quadrivium. And if you think about it, obviously, arithmetic, music, you had to have this in deep long-term memory. One can usefully speak of the ways in which grammar, logic, and rhetoric variously draw on functions of memory. So one can also speak of arithmetical, geometric, cosmological, and musical memory as memory craft was brought to bear within the subject matters and procedures of those four arts. Have you ever tried to tell your students, or ever used the technique of having them write out their words 5 times, or 10, or 20, or 25? I will not talk in 5, you know. You literally have them write it out multiple times, because what are we trying to develop? Muscle memory. I mean, is there anyone here who can write CEI without flinching? It's I after E. Oh yeah, you can write CEI, but CIE you just can't, because your muscle hand will just not let you do that. So even that is a type of memory training to seriously include. In current practice, we use rather simplistic locations or patterns compared to some of the earlier practitioners. Here's an example of an earlier practitioner helping the students to locate the duties of confession and all the parts of it. Now, with this serif, they would start with the main categories, and then they would flesh out the subcategories. You could get this image and white it out and copy it for your children, your students, if you wanted to, or you could create your own image that's a very elaborate, that has enough space. You might have seen online, I know I've seen some memory images like of a library, where you've got the bookshelf, and every book is blank, and you can write a fact as the title for every book. And as you learn another fact, you fill in another title. I have seen it also as a very elaborate image of a banquet table, and the facts go on the utensils, and on the plate, and on the goblet, and on the serving, and the candelabra, so that you're having your students fill out an image over a course of time. I mean, like, I would say this is probably going to be at least maybe a semester's worth of memorizing work, but that then you could give them a blank one at the end of the semester, and they would be able to remember from the location how to fill in all of these various things. It's what we're doing when we give them map quizzes, if you think about it. You give them a map, and they fill in the rivers and the mountains and the capitals and the states, and then you give them a blank one. They're doing the exact same thing. So it's the same concept. I think we've simplified it a little bit more. So any of you ever do the map thing? Yep, I think so. That's one example. I've got another example to show you in a few more slides. Linking words. Okay, linking words. We do linking words all the time. You take two components and you link them through either a visual or an auditory connection, association, visual or auditory. So, and I know this is kind of elementary, but if I start counting, I think you could fill in the other words. One, not the number yet. What rhymes with one? One bun, two shoe, 3, 4, 5. You guys never heard all that? Please, some of you. Yes, okay. Well, some of us have had a little bit more mnemonics in our past, maybe than others. It helps if when you're trying to do a word, an auditory association, if it makes sense. Because obviously, bun, shoe, see, door, hive, fix, heaven, gate, line, pen doesn't make any sense once you take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of it. It rhymes, but it doesn't really make any sense. What about every good boy does fine? Now, that would make sense, and what else does it represent? The notes on the treble clef. Or use initials. Roy, be, give. Roy, be, give are the colors of the rainbow and in the order. So see, if it's a logical and making sense auditory or visual thing, it'll be much easier to for your students to remember. Less effective memorizers generally say what is to be memorized over and over again. That's all they're doing. They're just parrot. Does a parrot understand? Can a parrot? Do we really say a parrot has learned what the parrot can say? When that's all they're doing is just rote memory. That's the mechanical or habitual repetition of something to be learned. Synonyms, mechanically, automatically, unthinkingly, mindlessly. See, that's the problem. That's why teachers don't believe in memorizing anymore. They think it's those things. I think it's just rote memory. It's not rote memory when it leads on to being applied and drawn back out. The memory model is applicable to all curricular areas where material needs to be memorized. It can be used with groups or by individuals. It has many uses in teacher-led memory sessions. When I, again, was a Spanish teacher, I would usually start my class off when we had our memory work assignment of, say, the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. That would be the first thing we would do, we would recite a line or 2 lines, and as we got through the 6 weeks that they had to memorize it, we'd add more lines. We would do that on a daily basis. So, but that was me leading it. Memorization is most beneficial when it's not the external person doing the pulling out. And this is the critical thing of why we need to teach our students how to do it themselves. They need to be thinking, okay, I got to remember Roy B. Gibb because I love rainbows, and I want to remember the colors of them. Yeah, Roy B. Gibb will help me so that all my life I will be able to remember that it gives me the power and the control over my own knowledge. That is what we want to instill in our students. Not, oh yeah, Senor Veith is making us spout off all this stuff and I don't even know what it means. So we want to teach our students to use it independently. And we got to tell them that, or else they'll think once they're out of our class they can forget about it. No, this is the tool for you to have for the rest of your life. You can always remember, even if you lose a hand and you can't write, or if you lose an eye and you can't see, you can still have your mind and you can still remember. So, teach your students the following steps. Organize the information. Organize the information to be learned. The more organization is, the better organized it is, the more they're going to be able to add information in as they learn more. Organized by categories. So always introduce your students to categories. And then they will start picking that up themselves. Okay, categories. Nouns, numbers of syllables, colors, whatever category you want to come up with. But introduce the concept of remembering it by the category of it. And that will be helpful. Secondly, within the category, order the information. Now, that's just another way of saying organizing it. So in other words, you give them the big organization, and then within the category, you give them another lineup of information. Because if you're presenting the information to them in a series, and they know it's going to be in a series, then that's how they'll learn it. It'll make more sense to the series. Now remember, it's why on the math pages they always have the what's the missing number, because you're trying to teach them how to fill in what's missing, because they know it's a series. So, link the information, again, this is the concept of the association. Link it to familiar material, whether it's by sounds, like the one bun, two shoe, three tree, four door. Meanings, especially when you're doing vocabulary, that's a wonderful opportunity to introduce them to the family of related words. So when you have agra, and what does agra mean?
Land or field.
Land or field. So when we're talking about agriculture, or we're talking about, help me out with some more agra words. There's got to be more.
Countryside.
I mean, starting with agra in it.
Oh.
Maybe I should have picked stellar. I can think of more stellar. Anyway, the point is that will expand their vocabulary because they've learned something. So link it to visual images or to associated information. Build on what they already know. That's a concept that I do think it's called prior knowledge. Nowadays, they say you have to activate the prior knowledge. Well, yeah, link it to what they already know. Use the devices that make it vivid. You know, you don't think in black and white, probably. Why should our students be learning and thinking knowledge is in black and white and flat, two-dimensional? It isn't. And practice it and give feedback to the students. Practice that and give feedback. When I'll just leave you with this one last practice that I had, and as far as I know, I invented it. I didn't run across anybody else. I would write the sentence that we were going to work on the memory work on the board. You know, Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos. And we'd say it 5 times, all of us. Then I would erase cielos. Padre nuestro que estás en los, and they could remember. They just said it 5 times. Then erase los. Padre nuestro que estás en, and they were building it. They were putting it, and their image may have been the chalkboard, but I mean they were at least getting the pattern they were saying. I got it to where by the end of the 6 weeks, I could have just the initial of each line. And from the first letter only, they could go ahead. And remember, these are people who did not want to be doing it. And yet, they were able to do that. So, we'll pick up more ideas and practices. And please be thinking about what you do, but I'd like some of it to be shared. Thank you.